Well, good evening. So when you hear the word sanctity, what kind of a definition comes to your mind? Maybe you think of the word holy, something that is different or set apart from something else. Or maybe you think of purity, something that is without blemish, or cleanliness, something that is without stain. And so based upon those definitions that come to our mind when we think about the word sanctity, what are some of the things that we try to maintain the sanctity of? You may think about marriage. I think the word sanctity a lot of the times is used most commonly in discussions about marriage. And to protect or maintain the sanctity of marriage is to protect the original design or purpose of marriage. But there are also many other things that we try to maintain the sanctity of. We want to maintain the sanctity of our homes or of our families, and that may be through the influences that are had on our children or the things that we watch or we do at home, or even the fact that the majority of us want to keep our homes clean. We want to keep the dirt out of the house and keep the house clean. That is trying to maintain the sanctity of our families or of our homes. We also try to maintain the sanctity of our country by living up to the standards by which we were founded. And we even want to have some kind of sanctity even within things like the food that we eat. Because the foods that we eat, we want them to be clean and healthy. We want them to be free from disease and bacteria and things that would hurt us. We try to maintain the sanctity of a lot of different things in life. So why is it that a lot of the times we fail to try to maintain the sanctity of the church? You see, the church was designed to be holy. That is, the church was designed to be made up of holy saints who have been set apart from the world as God's covenant people. And for us to be set apart from the world, that means that the sin that is present outside in the world is not to be present within the church. Because we are people that have been freed from our slavery to sin through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And so the sin that is present out in the world is not intended to be present in the church. Listen to what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5. He says, "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor cruel joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving." Paul says here that there is no room for impurity at all to exist in the church, because impurity is not proper for saints, or it's not proper for holy people. People that have been set apart and are to be distinctive from the world. Now, that does not mean that Christians are never going to sin. That's an unrealistic expectation. We are going to sin. We are going to fall short. The point that Paul is making, and the point that we need to understand about the holiness of the church, is that while we will mess up from time to time, sin is not to be a common occurrence amongst the church, because as Paul says, it's not proper for saints. However, I believe a lot of the time we've become content with the existence of sin within the church. We've just kind of accepted certain things that take place in the church as this is just the way that things are and the way that they are going to be. There are some sins that have become so pervasive in the world that we live in that many of us have become numb to their sinfulness and just kind of accept them as commonplace among church people. But as we saw that Paul said, this was not the way that the church was designed. So what do we do? How do we react to sin within the church? And Jesus gives us an interesting teaching about church discipline in Matthew chapter 18 that we're going to spend some time looking at tonight. So if you have your Bibles, flip over to Matthew chapter 18. We're going to be in verses 15 through 20. Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 15, the first thing that Jesus says is, He says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And if he listens to you, you have gained your brother. And the first thing that I want to draw our attention to in this text is that word brother, which is probably better translated brother or sister. It's familial language. It refers to the fact that the church is intended to be a family, which is a concept that we talked about several Sunday mornings ago. And as we talked about at the beginning of this lesson, we seek to maintain the sanctity of our family. If somebody in our family is doing something that is harmful to them or is harmful to our family, we're very quick to step in and try to do something about that, but we're a lot less likely to step in and do something when it's our church family. And another thing that I want to note here is Jesus says, if your brother sins against you. That phrase there, against you, is not found in many manuscripts, and it is not included in any of the quotations of this passage by the church fathers. And the only reason I mention that is because if we take out that phrase, then this statement by Jesus is referring to sin in general. And that idea would work alongside of passages such as Luke 17 and verse 3 and Galatians 6 and verse 1. But if we include it in here, then Jesus is specifically talking about sin against another person, when an individual in the church has been wronged by another Christian. And so in light of those two ideas, I think we would do well to read this text in light of both of those concepts, being wronged by someone and sin in general that exists within the church. And so Jesus begins here and says that if one of your fellow Christians is living in sin, or if one of your fellow Christians has sinned against you, your first response is to go and speak to them privately about the issue. And what a profound statement that is by Jesus, because I would say that the majority of us don't react first by going and actually talking to the person that has wronged us or the person that's in sin. When we get upset or we're wronged or we think that someone has done something that they should not do, our first reaction is typically to go talk to everybody but the person. Gossip is something that can become really, really bad in the church. We want to complain about that person, or we want to go let everybody else know what they did, but we have no desire to actually go and talk to them and deal with the matter privately, as Jesus said here. And when we do these things, what happens is we just end up making the problem worse than it was in the first place. Because all we do is we stir up problems within people, within the church as a whole, a problem that probably could have been solved if we would have just gone and talked to them privately. Sometimes when I think of the way some stuff happens in the church, I think of that new Geico commercial. Maybe have you seen the Geico commercial about office gossip? There's a lady, and I think she's breaking up with her boyfriend, and she's the only one in the office. But as she's doing this, these chipmunks or hedgehogs or something like that start popping up around the office and sharing all of it. And the tagline is, as long as office gossip spreads quickly, Geico will be able to save you on car insurance, or however it goes. I really think they could have made that commercial about the church sometimes. As long as church gossip spreads quickly, Geico can save you on car insurance. So Geico is going to be able to save us for quite a while, I think. But my point is, our first reaction is a lot of the times to go and talk to everybody but the person that we have this problem with, and it just stirs things up more because it gets more and more people involved in a problem that probably could have been handled with just the original two. And when we do go speak, when we do actually get around, if we ever do, to go speaking to the person, a lot of the times we have the complete wrong mindset in doing that. We want to prove the other person wrong, and that's why we go talk to them. Or we go talk to them to kind of have our ego elevated when they're forced to apologize to us, and we really don't care about restoring that individual. But Jesus says that what should be behind, what our motive should be in going and talking to that person is the love that we have for them and the fact that we hate to see them in sin. It should never be for selfish reasons. And so Jesus begins and says, if someone is living in sin, or if one of your fellow Christians has wronged you, go and speak to the person privately. And then he goes on and says, well, if that doesn't work, he says, but at verse 16, but if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So if the offender will either not recognize his wrong, not recognize that he has sinned, or is unwilling to make a change, Jesus says the next step is to take 2 or 3 people with you and to go talk to that person a second time. And if that still doesn't work, Jesus said the issue needs to be taken before the entire church. Verse 17. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. And so I think that the purpose of bringing other people into the mix, whether it be the 2 or 3 witnesses that Jesus says is step 2, or bringing it before the entire church, which he says is step 3, I think the purpose is to prevent misinterpretation and to protect both parties that are involved in this dispute or in these accusations. Because potentially what could happen is the one who is making the accusation could be wrong. He or she could have misunderstood something that happened. They could not have all of the information. There could be some prejudice involved between them and the person that they are accusing. Or they could simply be taking too hasty of action about whatever it is that's going on. Therefore, what happens when you allow other people to get involved is you let other people look upon the situation and make a judgment for themselves. For if the entire church cannot get behind the accusation that's being made, chances are it's probably not a very good accusation. There's something that has gone wrong in the process. So in bringing other people into this, what it does is it protects both the accuser and the sinner. But Jesus says, after you've taken these 3 steps, you've gone and you've talked to the person privately, you've brought other people in, you've brought some witnesses, you've brought it before the whole church to make sure you're right in the accusations that are being made, to allow these other people to help to convince this wayward sinner to come back, to repent of what it is that they have done, to ask for forgiveness and come back. Jesus says, after you've done those things, He says that that individual is to be excommunicated from the assembly. You aren't to have anything to do with them. And so that leads us to the big question of the night. Is this process something that we should be practicing? Is it something that should be practiced today in the 21st century? And my short answer to that is, well, Jesus told us to do it, so I think we would do good to do what Jesus tells us to do. But also, in light of the holiness of the church that we talked about earlier, that the church is designed to be made up of holy saints, where Paul says there should be no impurity in your midst, we must understand that sin cannot exist in the church. We are called to be holy and set apart from the world, to look different. And so why is it that the majority of churches, the majority of people don't practice this process? It's one that I've personally never seen or heard, at least in my circles, of having ever taken place. If this is something that Jesus tells us to do, if the holiness and sanctity of the church is so important, if we are in fact called to be holy and different, to be set apart from the world, for sin not to be in our midst, why is it that we don't practice texts such as this one? And one reason, I think, is because of the comfort that we have with certain sins, as we talked about at the beginning of the lesson. That some sins have just become so common in our society that we have accepted them as sins that are just going to be a part of the church, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And so we just kind of let them happen. Another reason that I believe that many churches don't practice this is I think that a lot of churches are too concerned with their membership and attendance numbers. Because who wants to be a part of the church that's kicking people out? And how are you expected to grow your numbers if you're asking people to leave? And so if your main focus is on your numbers, it's going to be real difficult to rationalize such an approach as this to discipline. Another reason, I think, is because we don't want to offend anyone. If we're going to practice something such as this, it causes us to confront other people's sins, and that's not something that we're comfortable doing. It's also something that many of us probably consider unloving. But if confronting sin is unloving, then Jesus was one of the most unloving people to ever walk the face of the earth. Do you remember when Jesus flipped over the money changers' tables in the temple, or when he called the Pharisees a brood of vipers? Jesus was in the business of confronting sin. You see, true love for people does not focus on their discomfort right here and now as much as it focuses on their eternal discomfort in the future. If we care more about how a person is going to respond now than we do about where they're going to spend eternity, do we really love that person? And I also think one of the biggest reasons that churches do not practice texts such as these is because of the way that we have personalized sin. Many of you, maybe when we were reading this text, might have been confused or taken back by some of the words that Jesus said here, and ask yourself, well, isn't my sin just between me and God? What does my personal life have to do with the church? How can the church tell me what I can and cannot do? And I just want to be straight with you tonight and say that that mindset is a warped understanding of what the church was intended to be, because each and every one of our personal sins does not just affect us and our relationship with God, it impacts the church as a whole. I want you to notice what Jesus goes on to say after he gives us these 3 steps that all has to do with the power of the church. Verse 18. He says, "Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them." So Jesus here makes 3 separate statements about the power of the church community. First, he says that it is the church who does the work of God on earth. It is the church that does the work of heaven upon earth. We are to represent God to the world. That goes back to a little bit of what we talked about this morning about being created in the image of God. When we are living in the way that God has called us, we are to show God to the world, to be God's representatives, to do God's work on earth. And then he goes on to say that the prayers of the church carry a heavy amount of weight. The prayers of the church are more weighty than any other prayers. What he's saying is that prayers that have the entire church have a certain amount of power to them. It's an interesting concept that I don't think we can fully understand, but when you read about prayer throughout Scripture, you see the idea of the power of prayer when you get the entire church behind it. And lastly, he says that God is present within the church community. God is with us. You see, the church has power. The church is a powerful group of people, but it cannot adequately use its power if sin is present in its members, because sin fights against the very character of holiness that defines the church. And the church is intended to utilize the power that God has given it. The church is intended to bear the fruit of God to the world, but a dead limb cannot produce fruit. That's the point of the sinful member and what Jesus is talking about here. If the members who make up the church are living contrary to their calling as the church, the power of the church is weakened, or it is just plain useless or non-existent, because fruit cannot be born from a dead limb. And so if numbers is something that you're concerned about, you would be surprised what could come about from pruning. Because when dead limbs are pruned, there is more room for the living limbs to bear fruit, and the power of the church is magnified. Fruit cannot be produced from a dead limb. And so I want to end tonight with this question. What does this practically look like for the church here at White House? We've talked about a lot of concepts. We've talked about what the church is to look like, the importance of sin not existing within the church. But what does this disciplinary process that we see Jesus talking about here in Matthew 18 practically look like for us here? And I have 4 suggestions that I want to make. I put them in your handout tonight. And you may not completely agree with me on these 4 things, and that's absolutely fine. These are just the 4 ways that I believe that we can best try to live out the principles that we see in this text. And the first thing is that if somebody wrongs you, or you are upset with another member here at this church, the first thing you need to do is go speak to them privately. Don't start gossip. Don't go to your friends and start complaining about that other person. Do not even go to the elders or the ministers first and complain to them about what's going on and ask them to do something. But go to the person individually and take care of the matter privately. Do not involve anyone else. That's the first step that all of us should take when we have been wronged. And secondly, if you see someone who is blatantly living in sin, if there is a major and obvious sin in their life, and you know this for sure, go speak to them privately in a spirit of love and compassion. Do not go talk to them unless you are absolutely sure about what has taken place, and do not go and talk to them unless you are able to do it in a spirit of love and compassion. Ask yourself before you go, is it my love for this person's soul that is compelling me to do this? Or am I just trying to fill some kind of personal need that I have? And if you can't speak to them with love, compassion, and empathy, don't speak to them at all. Third, if private conversation does not work, and only if you have tried to talk to them privately. This does not go for if you have not done one of the first 2 things first. That's why they're number 1 and number 2. You do them first, and then you move on to number 3. So if private conversation does not work, and only if you have tried to talk to them privately, at that point, take your concern to the elders. Allow the elders to be those 2 or 3 witnesses that Jesus talks about here. And then once you do that, allow the elders, as the shepherds of our congregation here, to decide how the person will be approached moving forward, and respect their decision as our appointed leaders. And this is still not a time to share your problem with anyone else or to go around gossiping about that person. There is never a time to do that, but continue at this point to keep the issue between you, that other person, and the elders. And lastly, number 4, let the elders decide if the issue needs to be brought before the congregation. I think it is the best practice for us to allow the elders to be the ones to make this decision as the shepherds of our church rather than us. So again, once we bring the issue before the elders, we need to respect their decision for how the issue should be handled. There may be a better way, there may be other ways to live out this principle, but I think these are the 4 best ways for us at White House to live out the principle that Jesus gives to us here in Matthew chapter 18. Because the point that He's making is, as the church, as holy saints, sin cannot be present in our midst. Because when sin is present, it fights against the very identity of who we are as the church and hinders our ability to use the power that God has granted to us as the church. Because I cannot say this enough times tonight, I think this is the 4th or 5th time, fruit cannot be borne from a dead limb. A dead limb only hurts the tree. It can't do anything to help it. And actually, by trimming off the dead limbs, you just give more opportunity for the living ones to produce fruit and to grow and to thrive. That's the point that Jesus is making for us. Based upon our identity, we can't have these things take place in the church, and so He gives us a process to keep these things from taking place. And it begins with us not bringing the entire church into it. That eventually comes into place. It's not stirring things up and simply making things worse, but it's trying to deal with the problem privately to begin with. And then moving on from there through our church leadership, through our elders, to deal with the problems that are hindering our ability to live our calling as the church. I would encourage you to consider these words, consider how you can try to live out this process, and most importantly, I would encourage you to consider your own lives. Are you one of those dead limbs? And if you are, the great thing about the gospel is you can always begin to bear fruit again. Come to Jesus in a spirit of repentance. He will forgive you, and you can begin to live once again for Christ and bear the fruit that maybe you haven't borne in quite a while. If that's you and you would like to make that response, or if we can help you in any other way this evening, I would ask you to come as we stand and sing. Let us reach out.